Hello there. Last year was full of experiences. AI was starting to make images, text, write poems, it does music, by now it does movies almost there, and which causes a lot of fear, angst, emotions, excitement as well. It's both exciting and scary times. And recently also we started to get more and more similar vibes for software development, because here the CEO of NVIDIA says that our mission is that so that nobody has to program. Programming language will be natural English language or other languages. So that's the goal. And then also recently, Cognition Labs hyped and marketed a lot their Devon AI product, which is for now not available to everyone. There is just a waiting list. But people are sharing what it can and cannot do and how approximately it works. So it was a good time to share a presentation that I actually made for work last year in September, because I was playing throughout the last year with making ChatGPT write code. And I made this presentation to chronicle my changing views on what it can and cannot do. And I think it's actually a good time to share it now because I'm continuing to experiment and see what it can and cannot do. So here I updated it a bit and wanted to share with you guys on the channel. Let's begin. So long time ago, by AI standards, or in 2022, coding with AI looked more like this. Products like Tab9 were auto-completing your code. You start to write, they propose some kind of code, you need to accept it, you need to read it. Not always is right, correct, exactly the code you want. It has mistakes and it integrates wrongly within the code, so on and so on. So it's not always works. Now, I don't know about you, but for me, this was far from experience I want from working with AI. What instead I would prefer is to write tests and then make AI write code, run the tests. If they fail, check the error, try to run the code again, and do it until it passes, and only then I want to read the code. I'm not very interested in reading the code that is wrong. I'm interested in reading code that works. So this is how I wanted to work with AI on code. But in 2022, there was nothing like this on the market. But things were slowly changing. In November of 2022, OpenAI released ChatGPT. Uh, Initially, it was not used for coding. It was used for language, translation, poems, and writing all kinds of content and so on. It was a fun toy. But in January, my wife, who works in school, decided to give it a test. It gave it a math assignment from something like a seventh grade. It wanted to see if it can solve it, but even more interested she was in whether it can create more assignments like this for the students and lower the load on her and her work. Now, looking at what she was trying to do, my reaction was that it's actually not the right tool for the job because LLMs are slow, expensive, and actually kind of bad for this kind of thing. And we already have a lot of things that are better at it, like calculators, MATLAB, or Wolfram Alpha, or you can learn to write code software and use that for solving mathematical problems or generating math home assignments. So that was my thinking at the time, that it's not the right tool for the job. But I decided to give it a test. I wrote a function, and I left the body empty. It has 3 arguments. I wrote a little bit of code that generates random values for it and calls the function and expects 2 values back, x1 and x2. And I also wrote a little bit of a test. Now, if you would check this all out, you will see that what I was trying to ask it to do, it was to solve a quadratic function. Give me the roots. Pretty usual thing that most of us did in school, right? You just need to know the formula and how to apply it. So I gave it this code and asked it to fill in the function, which it did. After which I copied all of that code into execution environment, ran it, got an error, gave it back. It said, oh, oops, I've made a mistake, but I know what's wrong now. So let me fix it. And it wrote more code. I copy pasted again, I ran it again, I got an error. And then repeat and repeat and repeat. And basically it failed. It was not narrowing down on any kind of real solution. It was like monkey patching or cheating or something, like a bad student. So it didn't work back then. It couldn't do even this kind of simple stuff. it was way worse than humans at this. That's were my first thoughts. But thinking more about it later, I started to ask a question. Is this reasonable? Are we comparing it correctly? Because in reality, the way we humans work with code today is not like this. We actually have access to so-called integrated development environments that have hintings, type checkings, lintings, all kinds of help. We also debug, we run, we use the software, and so on and so on. This is not how AI does that. To compare it to human, we would need to compare it to a human who never saw a computer, who never saw it or used the integrated development environment, who never used or debugged applications, who only read about it. And then we give him a piece of paper and ask him to write on a piece of paper from the first time an app that should run from the first try. Is that a reasonable expectation for a human being? I actually don't think so. I think that most of us, without a spell checker, would have problems of writing this and will make mistakes. So obviously AI makes mistakes, it's just the wrong setup for it to work. Well, still, in February, OpenAI released ChatGPT Plus with a new, more powerful model, GPT-4. But to get access, you needed to pay $20 per month, which felt a lot at the time. Considering how well GPT 3.5 and free version worked, I was not interested. I was not expecting too much out of it. So I skipped. But then, in March, OpenAI released Code Interpreter and internet access for it. Now, internet access was interesting, yeah, okay, but in a sense that ChatGPT can search internet based on your questions better than you do. And it can actually mash together results of multiple searches. But Code Interpreter was way more interesting than that. Because what Code Interpreter is, maybe you know by now, but basically it's an ability, it's a functionality inside of ChatGPT where you ask things in natural language and it writes Python code, starts a server instance, an environment where it can execute that code, sends that code there, runs it, gets results back. Maybe it gets mistakes back. Then it says, there is a problem, let me rewrite that, writes new code, sends again, maybe gets mistake again, tries again. So it does something similar to what I did with GPT-5. But it works. It works more often than not. And it actually works pretty well. I first heard about it from this guy, Chad Sculp. He's a data journalist from Canada, from Vancouver, and he had a video in which he demonstrated how it works. He gave it a dataset, asked in natural language without any kind of hinting on specific questions, asked it, what interesting does it see there? And among things it saw there, after analysis, after writing Python code to do the analysis of what is inside of the dataset, it said that, hey, I think there is actually a data entry error in there. And he said, interesting. Why do you think so? And can you prove it? And it explained why, and wrote code to test it and said with confidence, yes, there is. And Mr. Chad here knew that there is. It was actually a data set he was giving to his students as a test to see if they can find something there. And they couldn't. Well, this thing from the first try did. And it actually wrote code to prove that it's the case. So I don't know about you. I don't know, maybe today in 2024 it's not actually impressive, but it was shocking in March of 23. So my reaction was, shut up and take my money. This is when I bought ChatGPT Plus subscription, and I haven't cancelled since, as it keeps on giving more and more valuable things. But anyways, I subscribed. Sadly, I didn't read the small text in there, something that Code Interpreter is in alpha, and buying Plus subscription doesn't give you access to it. You need to be in waiting list, which I immediately subscribed to, but I didn't get access for a while. So, but I did get access to GPT-4, and I decided to give it a try, to give it a test, the same test I gave to a free version before it. To my surprise, it succeeded from first try. No errors, just worked. Well, okay. Then I decided that, okay, if it works, let's push it until it breaks to see where it breaks. And that rabbit hole went far. Because first, I asked it, hey, okay, let's make it harder. Let's make it toward third power polynomial with 3 roots that is more complex, pun intended. It did it again from the first try. It actually even found some kind of errors in my tests and improved them. But I also noticed that sometimes the solution it gave me returns only one route, which I knew could be because sometimes they match, but I decided to ask it, why is this the case? And to my surprise, it said something more complex than I expected. It said that sometimes this kind of polynomials have complex roots, and JavaScript only has real numbers. It doesn't have support for complex numbers with the imaginary part. And I asked, okay, what can we do? And here the full surprise came in. It said, well, you can add this kind of library that adds support to JavaScript for complex numbers. And then I can rewrite a solution for you so that it will be finding complex roots. I said, okay, let's do that. It did that, and it worked. Well, as I said, this rabbit hole was going far. By the time it started to fail, I had a full-on React application with interactive UI, with a chart showing where the roots are. What? Last year, this was very, very, very surprising. I can actually even show you this thingy. Yeah, here it is. Here is the thing that it wrote. A button randomizes the input parameters, draws a function, shows that there are two complex roots and one real one. Freaking unreal. We can even check the code. This is the code it wrote. With me only asking in natural language, I was not even hinting it much. At least, I mean, this is my impression. So yeah, 300 lines of code. React and other things. That's where we were in March. But it did start to fail because it started to get a little bit lazy in its outputs. When I was asking it to make changes, it was only writing the code that changed and asking me to replace or edit somewhere by myself, which was not fun. And it started to make mistakes because it was getting kind of lost where what is and trying to reference wrong variables. So I think somewhere by this stage, 300 lines of code, it needed my help. So anyways, at the time, as a something to write application with, my feeling was that it was slow, involved a lot of copy pasting from the chat, and it was making a lot of mistakes due to context size limitations. So that's where we were back then. But time was going. It was May 2023. NVIDIA, Caltech, Stanford released a paper that blew my mind again. They released the Voyager, a bot for Minecraft that gets as input textual description of what it sees, what is in its inventory, what is its status, and also gets description of what actions can it perform. And then it writes what actions it wants to perform. But that's not it. Even more interesting part was that it could decide that instead of describing in text what it wants to do, it could write code and run it against the interface of the game. It could run it, check if end result is as it's expected, and if it is, it was saving it into a library of reusable skills. So it was writing code, reusable code for itself to run next time it needs to perform same action, solve same problem. What's more, this was the best performing bot, AI bot for Minecraft at the time, who in least amount of time managed to craft all things that are craftable in this world, which means it needed to survive. It needed to explore. Now this is still, even today, this is bonkers, to be honest. Also, in the same month, another paper came out, also from Stanford, but also Princeton and from Google DeepMind. In that paper, they did also something interesting. They used the model like GPT-4 to write functions that model that is smaller, like GPT-3.5, could use to solve problems. And it did it in a way where, by using those functions, smaller, cheaper, faster model improved its benchmarks, its performance in solving problems. So large, expensive, slow model was making tools for small, cheap, and fast models so that they perform better. Large model improves small model while keeping it cheap. Okay, that's also very, 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 very surprising. By this time, my views were changing. And I really, after these papers, wanted to get my hands on to trying something like this. And I still didn't have access to Code Interpreter, which made me think that, wait a second, ChatGPT is actually in the browser. And browsers, in each page, has actually a running Code Interpreter, JavaScript Code Interpreter. So can I just, yeah, sorry. So can I just create a bookmarklet or maybe a Chrome extension that takes those neat code blocks that it generates and make them runnable? And then I maybe can make code run right inside of ChatGPT. It will be faster and easier to try and see if it can do in something like interesting things. So that's actually what I did back at the time. I called it ChatGPT JavaScript Interpreter. Now, the way it worked was that it's a button. You can drag it into your bookmarklets bar, and when you in ChatGPT click the button, it finds all the JavaScript blocks and adds run button to it. You can run the button, and it will run the code. You can see it's alert, hello from JavaScript Interpreter, hello from JavaScript Interpreter, and it also will show you results and errors. And you can copy paste them quicker into the chat and do some fun stuff. Now, today, sadly, after all the changes, it doesn't work, and I lost interest. There are more interesting things to do. But you could do things like add an image upload and text recognition into ChatGPT before Vision came out. Or you could add bar charts. You could do, yeah, you could add visual audio visualization. It looked kind of like this. Let me do this. So yeah, here is a chat. We run a code. We get a UI element added to the page. So it adds this thing. We can now load a file, any kind of MP3 file, and it does a visualization. Actually, let me turn on. Yeah. No way. So today this sadly doesn't work, but we can actually see the chat just as a demo. So here is a chat where it created it. I just asked, like, write me a JavaScript function that creates a file input for audio files and only adds it to the DOM positioning, blah, blah, blah. It's kind of specific language, but it's relatively simple. In theory, I could ask it to think step by step, and it will do something very similar. So this is a chat that resulted in the code and video that I showed you. So this is something I did back then. And honestly, it worked. Then they started to restrict things, not allow to load third-party libraries, and honestly, it was just very easy, very quick test to see how far can it go in writing and interacting with the working application. And it was fun. I was seeing that it actually can do a lot, and I couldn't yet see what are the limitations. And after all of that, OpenAI also launched new models and added so-called function calling to them. They taught their models to read documentation for APIs and decide when, based on user requests, it makes sense to make a call to one of the APIs. It would write all the parameters, it would call it itself in ChatGPT, or if you are using it through API, it would send you the definition of the call so you can make it yourself. Basically, let's say you give it an API to doing Google searches, and you say to it, I want to know today's news. It will write a query to search for today's news and use API to search. And then we'll work with the results that are returned and interpret them to you. So OpenAI was jumping on the bandwagon as well and adding this to API so that anyone who uses their models can do similar things. Basically, by this point, my users changing hard. Yes, language models can't solve a lot of problems. They're still bad at mathematics. But it starts to look like they can actually write code. And that code can solve a lot of problems. And by this point, it's very hard to understand what cannot it do. In a sense that it can solve mathematics, it just needs to write code for it. It can, well, again, in theory, it can do whatever the code can do. And code can do a lot. And it can do some things that code doesn't. So is it the right tool for the job? Well, by itself, no. But if integrated with this kind of environments, probably. Time was going. In July, I got access to Code Interpreter. I probably not gonna show you how it works, but basically it was impressive. But it also had problems. It was incredible. It still is incredible. I actually think that to this day, this is the best tool on the market for non-developers, for getting access to things that only developers can do before, like data analysis, working with images, or with any kind of data. But still, it's limited because what it does, it launches in Linux environment. Actually, I think I will show you a little bit. So let's go to the chat and ask it. You have code interpreter. What are system specification in which it runs? Let's take a look. Yeah, okay, try to answer it on its own, but can you run code to see what are the specs? Yep. So you can see that it's writing code now and asking, yeah, system information. Now it gave it back. This is response from that environment. We can see that it's Linux, that there is some platform version, that this is architecture, CPUs are unknown, physical core. Interesting, actually, before it was more. I think there was 16 gigabytes, now it's one. It has 16 cores, but it is unknown what CPU that is, but it's x86-64. Okay, can you search your file system for database files? So again, it searches the system and didn't find anything, but I think, yeah, we can actually see here that it's searching specific folder. This is a folder used for files you upload. So it's searching a folder that is currently empty. Can you search from root? Now this is actually the example where if you're not a developer, if you're not very good with computers, can it actually help? Did it answer? Like I searched through the accessible file systems specifically within the designated directory for user files. I didn't find any. This area is where files typically store. Feel free to upload them. Okay. I'm limited to accessing only certain parts of the file system. Actually, it was doing that. I have a blog post where I shared what it has or has not. Okay, can you look up the folder? Oh boy, I actually reached my messages for the day. This is unusual. Okay, maybe I will need to resume filming this video later, but for now, let's actually return for presentation. And I will stop at the moment where I need to use ChatGPT again. But anyways, it's incredible. There are limitations, one of which are 50 messages in 3 hours. But still, there are other limitations as well. There is no network access for Code Interpreter, meaning you cannot ask it to scrap websites or something, or hack some API. This is probably why they don't allow network access, because they don't want to be liable for it writing some kind of hacking code that then is run on their server and is hacking someone. But anyways, it doesn't have network access, which also means that it cannot install things. It has a static list of libraries. The last time I checked, it was like something like 350 Python libraries that can do a lot, but it's still a limited list. It also means that if the code requires some kind of model, it cannot download it. So a lot of things don't work. A lot of things do, and a lot of things don't. So it also loses work. As I showed, it's a Linux environment. It starts on the server as you start to ask about Code Interpreter, and it doesn't run indefinitely. If you leave the chat for, I don't know, half an hour, return, and ask for things, back in the day, it would say that the environment stopped working and it would not restart it, and this is it. In this chat, you don't have access to Code Interpreter anymore. You need to start a new chat. Today, actually, it starts a new environment. But that environment will be empty. There is no code that it wrote before. There is no files that you upload that you need to upload again, which sucks. And honestly, I would prefer if it actually could run somehow against local stuff so that I could share a folder with it and it could do whatever in the folder or something. And again, it's not reusable. Let's say I did some very useful workflow with it. I return in a day and it's not working and the code is lost. I need to like go through the same steps again. Kind of bad. Still, this is to this day, in my view, the best option for non-developers, because all others require you to be proficient to some extent to be useful. So this was July. Um, Also in July, another thing came out, another paper called Gorrila. So this is a model fine-tuned uh, on connecting, on knowing a lot of APIs. Now, if you don't know what API is, basically it's kind of like a textual interface of how applications use other applications. For example, Facebook has an API. If you give access to third-party application, it can use that API to interact with Facebook in your place, get information, make posts, and do other things. So they fine-tuned the model to know a lot of APIs. Funnily enough, 2 weeks later, another paper came out called TollLLM that if Gorilla was something like 4 or 5,000 APIs, this one was 16,000. So this thing, when you ask it in natural language, hey, I have this kind of problem. How do I solve it? It would tell you, well, among 16,000 of APIs I know, you can use this in this combination, this way, sending this kind of parameters to solve your problem. Now, one thing I really like to do when evaluating this kind of things is to find comparisons. What do you compare this to? Is there some kind of database when a human being can search for those APIs? Is there a human being who knows 16,000 APIs and how to use them correctly? I don't know any human being who can do that. This thing is superhuman, at least as described. Now, what's funny is that to this day, I actually don't see those things used. I haven't seen anyone use it. Uh, well, there are people who use it, I mean, broadly. Broadly, people don't use this, which is interesting. But anyways, this is July. In August, my dissatisfaction grew again. I actually wanted this thing to do way more. It felt like Code Interpreter has a lot of potential, but inside of ChatGPT, it's very limited, and I wanted to unleash it to give it more. So I decided to take a Electron framework, which allows to package web applications as desktop applications and give them access to desktop functionality. So I took that and I made it load ChatGPT inside of it. Also, I made it launch a server for plugins. Thing is that along with function calling, OpenAI released plugins so that someone like me, a developer, could develop a plugin, launch it as a server, and register it with OpenAI. And then person could go and ask for, I don't know, for example, again, let's speak about Google Search. Someone could launch a server, integrate it with Google Search, provide API for ChatGPT plugins, and have basically Google Search be available as something ChatGPT can call inside of a chat. So what I did here for developers, you could launch the server on your computer locally. So this Electron app was actually launching locally and registering invisibly the plugin itself as a plugin, and through it, it was giving access to terminal so that it could configure, install, write code, execute code on your machine. And it also got access to Chrome. So it could open pages, manipulate pages, scrap pages, do things like Google search without having API for Google search because it can manipulate any kind of web page. So basically I did this thing to, again, try to understand where is the limit, what it can do and what it cannot do. So I did that. It's actually on GitHub. I stopped developing it because later they actually, OpenAI has deprecated plugins API in favor of another thing, and I will get to this. But as they deprecated plugins, they disallowed calling APIs from your local machines. You can do it only on hosted and on the internet machines. So this project lost all of its meaning in this form. So that was August. In September as well, similar projects started to pop up, slightly different. For example, one that blew up very hard was Open Interpreter. By the end of September, it has something like 20,000 stars, and by now it's like 40, and they are launching a hardware product and doing a lot of interesting stuff. But it's more like less about writing applications. It's more about manipulating your local applications. So that's Open Interpreter, but basically things were popping up. Now, this presentation initially I did for a company to share with other developers how this all looks. And I was sharing in the end with them a recap to show how things were changing, how my expectations were changing, how my mindset and thinking about it was changing. Because it was crazy here. In January, it felt like it's a toy, it's not the right tool for many jobs. But in February, a stronger model was already one-shot writing small applications, almost in natural language. You still needed to slightly know what to ask, but still, it was very impressive, more impressive than I have seen before. In March, it started like they started to launch data analysis, and which was allowing users without data analysts to do data analysis. Send it some kind of CSV file, crunch the numbers, draw the charts, speak about conclusions. Uh, it could find data entry errors that students couldn't. By May, it started to make tools that it could find the right moments to reuse. In July, there were models that knew how to choose among 16,000 of APIs to solve the user problem based on natural language prompts. And in September, easy to install local versions started to pop up, like Open Code Interpreter or like my experimenter with GPT Commander. So it was crazy year. And I remember that when I was telling this presentation in September, it felt surreal. A lot of it sounded nuts. I was actually sharing this presentation in December again with different group of people. And I remember like reviewing it again back then, some of it started to feel okay. It was not surprising anymore. The window was shifting and still is shifting in what is normal and not. Very fast. I mean, it was not even a year, it was what, 9 months? Well, today is April 2024, and things continue to change. At the time, I finished the presentation with a question. So what's next? Well, I joked that probably if pace of innovation will be the same, by the end of 2024, ChatGPT is going to ask for coffee breaks and to raise its salary. But that was a joke. In reality, in September, I was in a state of trying to understand, is sky the limit? Where is the sky? How high it is? Because my feelings were that it actually has way more, like models already released, have way more potential than wrappers that we made around them, like ChatGPT, Code Interpreter, or my experiments. It felt that if you integrate them correctly, they can do way more and could be way more useful. So I was still intent on experimenting more. And this is what I actually want to explore in next videos. Because I'm still exploring it. I actually by now have a feeling for where the limit is. And basically in next videos, I want to speak about things that I was doing since. Because in November, OpenAI released custom GPTs. They deprecated plugins, which means that Desktop Commander stopped working the way it was working. Instead, there are actions, and I actually extracted server part from Desktop Commander, called the ChatGPT Server Commander, refactored that it provides Actions API so that you can use it from ChatGPT, and then you can install it anywhere on your desktop machines on any kind of server, and connect it to ChatGPT and use it from your phone. So in my case, I was actually making it develop itself while I walked the dog in the forest from a phone. This is something I want to show in next videos. This one is already long as it is. This thing is on GitHub as well in open source. I will show you next time. What did I learn about the limit since then? In short, that there are still problems with context, with how well it understands large code bases, with how much it makes mistakes in large contexts. There are problems with speed, it's slow, and it's kind of expensive. Probably cheaper though than hiring a senior developer, but still expensive. It's not a toy when you use it for serious things. But I will share more about it and demonstrate more about it in next videos. By now, by April 2024, there are actually other tools that maybe will move the button since Code Interpreter in my view. I mean, there were a lot of things like GPT Engineer and others, they have problems. Again, I will show what I mean by that in next videos. But by now, there are tools like Devin, tools like Devika and OpenDevin pop up after the Devin. These tools actually start to do similar things to which I was sharing in this presentation. They integrate LLMs with browser, terminal, code environment, so that it can search for documentation, write code, execute it, test it, fix errors, iterate on it. It starts to get more interesting. Still probably for developers. Setting up OpenDevin or Devika, not for ordinary human. But This is types of things I will be also testing and showing to you in follow-up videos as I explore using these kinds of tools for building small prototypes, minimal viable products, exploring something like sole entrepreneurship using these kinds of tools. So if you're interested in this kind of topics, do hit like, leave comments, subscribe, so that next time I release a video about these topics, you will be able to see it. Thank you. See you next time.